Welcome back to the MOOC course titled Qualitative Research Methods. My name is Aradhana Malik and I'm helping you with this course. And we've been discussing various things. We've discussed what qualitative research is. We've discussed the strategies of inquiry. Now, in the previous lectures, we started talking about how we can go about collecting data. So we started with observation. Today, we will talk about interviews. The art of interviewing and what interviewing entails and how many, what do we do when we interview respondents for collecting data. So the interview. Now this is again, the information is from this book by Denzin and Lincoln. What is an interview? An interview is a conversation. It's the art of asking questions and also listening. Listening forms a very, very important part of the interview process. Listening refers to receptivity. Listening refers to interpretation. Listening refers to being open to the communication, the information coming from the respondents, recording that information in as objective manner as possible, and then representing it based on what one has heard, or what one has listened to. So listening is selective hearing. So when we talk about listening is such an important part of the interview. One part of the interview is asking questions. One part of the interview is establishing a rapport with the respondent. The other part of the interview is, and the most critical part of the interview, is receiving the responses that the respondents give us, and that is dependent upon our listening, how well we listen, how open we are, what we take in, what we filter out, etc. So what does an interview produce? The interview produces situated understandings grounded in specific interactional episodes. Understanding that is contextual. An interview gives us an understanding of the information exchanged within an interactional episode, within the interaction between the interviewer and the respondent. So the interviewer and the respondent exchange information, the interviewer asks questions, the respondent responds to those questions, and those questions, the responses to the questions asked by the interviewer are interpreted within a specific context. So the information is situated within a specific context. Okay. Perspectives on interviewing. Various perspectives are: one is that interviewing involves a set of techniques for generating and analyzing data from structured, group and unstructured interviews with respondents, participants and key informants. So the interview is perceived as a set of techniques for getting the data from the respondents within different settings. We'll talk about these three types of interviews. The concerns in this are logistics. The first concern is logistics and mechanics of arranging and conducting interviews, which is, how do you get people together? How do you conduct the interview? What kind of questions do you ask? What is the recording, the mechanism of recording the responses, etc. And costs and benefits of various interview strategies are also a concern for the interviewer. So how much do you spend, what information or how much information do you get out of it? The other perspective is that it's a particular kind of human encounter in the field that facilitates inquiry into sensitive information. Now, we may conduct interviews with people who are dealing with trauma, with people who are dealing with different kinds of issues. So, when we talk about interviewing respondents who are vulnerable, when we talk about getting information from the vulnerable populations, we talk about obtaining, we need to let them know what we are talking about. So we need to obtain informed consent. We need them to understand what we are getting at, why we are talking about what we are talking about, and we need them to agree to being interviewed. And that is what we talk about when we refer to obtaining informed consent. They need to know what is going on, and they need to agree to being interviewed despite their vulnerability or within their vulnerability. We need information about the vulnerability, so they need to agree to being interviewed within that vulnerability, knowing fully well that these questions are going to tap into something that they are feeling hurt about or something that they are sensitive about. So that is one of the concerns, that we need to obtain informed consent. The respondents need to understand what is it that is going on and why we need that information from them, and we may be able to help them, we may not be. In most cases, researchers are not able to provide any direct benefits to the respondents. We just take information, we write our papers, and we move on with our lives. The respondents are left hanging, dealing with whatever it is that they are dealing with. So that is, but many people still agree to participate in the research. So that is what we mean. The second is dealing with sensitive information. People may provide us with very, very sensitive information, with information that can hurt us, with information that can make them even more vulnerable. So when we talk about dealing with sensitive information, we need to know if it is, we'll come to the next point, which is anonymity. These things are connected. How do we treat that information? How much of that sensitive information do we record? What do we filter out? What do we remember but do not record? Many times the respondents will say that if you take this information and if you do not record it, I will give it to you, provided you don't write it down or you don't audio record it. So when such a situation arises, that is when we need to know how to deal with this kind of a request from the respondent. Then anonymity. Many times the respondents may give us some information that they want they want treated very differently. So they do not want to be named as the providers of that specific information. So anonymity is what we are going to be talking about. That is something we need to be sensitive to, and that is one big concern. Then the next is confidentiality. How do we maintain confidentiality? How do we maintain the how do we sanitize the data? How do we keep the confidence of our respondents? How do we make sure that that we get the information we need, but we do not make the respondents even more vulnerable because of the information that we are seeking from them? So, perspectives on interviewing. The interview is a linguistic event unfolding in particular socio-political contexts. The interview is an event that takes place specifically with the use of language, and language is what governs the effectiveness of the interview. So within a specific context. Okay, some assumptions of interviews for research. The interview is a behavioral event. It is spoken of as a verbal behavior, a verbal exchange, or a pattern of verbal interaction. The interview is it's behavior, and words are what govern this behavior. Then the interview process is framed within the context of stimulus response, question and answer type of situation. The interview process is it takes place with one person asking questions, the other person responding. So that is what an interview is all about. Then the interview situation is isolated from cultural and situational norms and frameworks of meaning. The interview is it is situated within the context, but it is also different from the meaning that we draw from different contexts, from the way we normally behave. These are specific questions that are asked of the respondents, and there are specific responses that the respondents give to the interviewer. So it's not like a normal conversation, it's a focused conversation in which information is exchanged between the interviewer and the respondent. Some types of interviews that we will talk about here, and these types of interviews are the ones that we will discuss here are structured interviews, unstructured interviews, and semi-structured interviews. So when we talk about the different kinds of interviews, we will not be discussing semi-structured interviews. We'll talk about the structured and unstructured interviews in this series of lectures, and we'll go through them one by one. Different types of interviews have different purposes. Okay. In structured interviews, the questions are framed to facilitate arrival at predetermined categories. There is a very clear set of questions, and these questions are framed with the explicit intention of arriving at different categories, at the categories that have already been decided. Now you'll say, when we talk about qualitative research as an exploratory research, we don't know what is out there, we are trying to find out what is out there. So we are trying to get information about what we do not know, and so how will structured interviews factor into this? So that is one big concern when we talk about predetermined categories. We decide what we want to arrive at, and we give the respondents a choice between various categories that we've already arrived at. So limited number of answers are there, and that is the questions are framed according to that. The questions are pre-established with limited responses and little or no flexibility. The questions are the answers are already predicted. It could be answer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, but we know that beyond these 4 or 5 or 6 choices there will be no different answer. So we know already how we are going to process the data that comes in. So there is little or usually no flexibility in structured interviews. The questions use very standard explanations. The questions are easy to understand, and there is no deviation from the introduction of the study, sequence of wording of questions, etc., because the interview is, it's a straight pattern. You design a question, you ask all the respondents the same questions, and the same kind of responses are expected from a variety of respondents. Then the interviewer abstains from interpretations and presents the questions as they have been presented in the interview. The interviewer does not explain the questions to the interviewed. The interviewer goes through the motions of the questions that are there in the interview schedule. So they ask the questions as they are presented in the interview schedule, and they do not try to improvise, they do not try to change, they do not try to provide explanations for the questions that are there. The interviewer does not try to improvise, the interviewer does not try to add to the meaning of the questions that are being asked. There is a balanced rapport between the interviewer and the respondent. The neutral attitude of the respondent and interested listening facilitate easy participation by the respondent. So a rapport is established between the interviewer and the interviewee, and there is no real change. The interested, the respondent seems to be or needs to be interested, the interviewer needs to be interested, and they both sort of take in and give out whatever there is. So that is there. Nothing is left to chance in the process or procedure. Everything is tried out and tested before administering the interview, and things are tried out. There is we test whatever it is that we are asking people, and then we we present it and we get the information. So nothing is left to chance. Everything is sort of pre-decided. You know what you are expecting in a structured interview. Then the sources of problems here are, the first one is the faulty memory of the respondent. The respondent may not remember what it is that they are being asked. The respondent may not remember what it is that they are they may not know what response to give you. They may not remember how to respond to you. Then the respondents may also want to give you socially desirable responses which may be incorrect. So you ask the respondent, for example, you say, okay, when you are angry in the workplace, how do you react? Do you shout at your colleagues? Do you stomp out of your colleague's office? Do you just lock yourself up in your office, or do you just smile and walk away? Now the most desirable response in this category of 4 responses that I've just talked to you about would be I just smile and walk away from the most difficult situation I encounter, or from a situation that angers me. Anger is a normal human emotion. That may not really be the case, but if a respondent says, I shout at my colleagues, or I give it back to them, so to say, that will be perceived as an outburst, an emotional outburst. So nobody, even if they do that in real life, they will not want others to know. They will not even want to acknowledge it to themselves. Why? Because the society desires that we do not participate in angry exchanges of emotions, especially in the workplace. So what they are doing is different from what they are reporting. They may just say, okay, I just smile away from a difficult situation. That may not be what happens in real life. So that is what we mean by socially desirable responses, which may not really reflect the real situation. The second here is the nature of the questionnaire, method of administration, or sequence or wording of questions. Now this is absolutely critical. Since all this is previously decided, since all of this is, we decide what we want to ask, how many answers we want, what do we want the respondents to say. So how we ask the questions is absolutely critical. The words that we use to design the questions will determine the kind of responses we get from these questions. And if we do not use the right words, we will not get the responses that can get us the answers we are seeking through our research project. Okay, so we need to ask the right questions in order for us to get the right answers from the situation. So the questionnaire, the way the questionnaire is designed, now there are various types of structured questionnaires. We don't have time for all that in this series of lectures, but various types of questions are there. You could have multiple choice questions. You could have the question on Likert scale, so least to most of a parameter, etc. But these are all closed-ended questions. A structured questionnaire is there. So how do you administer the questionnaire? How do you talk to the respondents? How do you get the respondents? What do you say to them? How do you start the conversation? All of these things could be there. Or sequence or wording of questions could also be a concern. The interviewer characteristics or inappropriate questioning techniques may lead to miscommunication of questions. That's another characteristic. The characteristics of the interviewer, what the interviewer is like, what the interviewer looks like, the gender of the interviewer. We'll discuss this in the next lecture to a greater extent. I mean, all of these things have an impact on the interviewee. We have discussed this time and again in this series of lectures in qualitative research that the mere presence of an interviewer, the mere presence of somebody going into a social situation with the intention of getting information from that social situation leads to the social situation changing itself, or the social situation or the behavior of another person being alert to the fact that he or she or the situation is being observed. And knowing that you're being observed will change the way you behave in situations. It's normal human social tendency to change when we know we are being observed. The other thing here is that try as hard as we might, but the physical characteristics of the interviewer, the physical characteristics of the situation, the situation that the interviewer brings with him or her, the biases of the interviewer as reflected in the presence of the interviewer in a situation will affect how the respondents respond to that interviewer, will affect how the situation around treats being observed, even if it's an observer. So we have, there's enough evidence in literature, in our in the lives that we lead around us regarding the characteristics of the interviewer affecting the interviewed, or the person or the observed. So I mean, this is another concern, that we need to be very, very careful while interviewing the respondents in order to get the correct responses from them. Okay, that is all we have time for in this lecture. We will continue with some more information about interviewing in the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.